well as it being the first night for many people here, it's also the first night of our new series, our exciting new series. Our new theme of talks, which is going to be running for the next few months. And these talks are about what is the most sublime, one of the most sublime ideas that human beings can aim for, can have as their goal. It's what's known as the Bodhisattva ideal. And it's, as well as being this sublime, wonderful concept, it's also a very practical path with lots of ideas about how we can become happier and how we can help those around us to be happy as well. So the title for the theme is The Way to the Beyond for the Benefit of All. And Bodhinaga and I are introducing it. I'm talking tonight and he's talking next week. And I'm starting with the benefit for all. And then next week Bodhinaga is going to tell us about the way to the beyond. And then, following that, there'll be mitra ceremonies, and then a whole series of talks that are going to look at 10 different ways, 10 different aspects of a path, how we can move ourselves towards becoming a bodhisattva, a being whose aim is to attain enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. And I think the interesting thing about Buddhism, as compared to a theistic religion, is that the highest that we're aiming for, we can become it. Okay, so in a theistic religion, there's God, but you will never become God, as I understand it. I might be wrong theologically, I don't know, but that's my understanding. Whereas in Buddhism, very definitely the idea is that we can move towards becoming the very highest that a human being can be. So that's what we're looking at. And I thought, actually, it's a bit like what we're offering you. I don't know if you're ever on Facebook or social media, I always fall prey to those things where it goes, 7 ways to be a really better person, 5 ways to be very fit, or something like that, you know. So it's basically, we're offering you 10 ways to be the coolest, most wonderful person you could ever be over these next 3 months. Okay. So I definitely click on that one, okay, if that one came up. Okay, so we're looking at the Bodhisattva ideal. Oh, I brought my name up actually, somewhere here, because I thought lots of you don't know me. So that's me, Satyajoyti. And the Bodhisattva ideal. So what does that mean? So, everyone can't see it at the back, it looks like. Okay, you have to come and have a look later. It says Bodhisattva ideal. Okay, so Bodhi is the beginning. What does it mean? Bodhi, as in Bodhinaga actually, Bodhi means awakening. It means enlightenment. So it means knowledge. It means knowledge in the sense of supreme knowledge, spiritual knowledge, knowledge of reality. And it means awakening to the sense of the ultimate truth of things, penetrating to the heart of existence. So Bodhi is what is usually translated as enlightenment. So it's the ultimate goal of the Buddhist life. And Sattva, this bit here, means a being, any living being. So a bodhisattva is an enlightenment being, a being of awakening, a being whose whole life is dedicated, whose whole energies are dedicated to the attainment of enlightenment. But the key thing about a bodhisattva is they're not just doing it for themselves, they're doing it for the benefit of all sentient beings. So that's not just humans, that's all sentient beings, animals, insects, etc. And that's not just beings on this planet, that's beings in a whole kind of system of worlds, millions and millions of planets where there are sentient beings. So, quite an ambitious task, really, to become enlightened so that you can help all these other beings to become enlightened as well. So I thought I'd start with a sense of what a bodhisattva might be like by having a reading from the Vimla-Kirti-Nadesha, which is a lovely sutra, a lovely teaching of the Mahayana, which I'm going to explain what Mahayana is later. But this reading is How Does a Bodhisattva Love? So Martin and Diaperna are going to come up and read that.
When a bodhisattva considers all living beings, he or she generates the love that is truly a refuge for all living beings.
The love that is peaceful, because free of grasping.
The love that is not feverish, because free of passions.
The love that accords with reality, because it is equanimous in all three times.
The love that is without conflict, because free of the violence of the passions.
The love that is non-dual, because it is involved neither with the external nor with the internal.
The love that is imperturbable, because it is totally ultimate.
Thereby he generates the love that is firm, its high resolve unbreakable, like a diamond.
The love that is pure, purified in its intrinsic nature.
The love that is even, its aspirations being equal.
The saint's love that has eliminated its enemy.
The Bodhisattva's love that continuously develops living beings.
The Tathagata's love that understands reality.
The Buddha's love that causes living beings to awaken from their sleep.
The love that is spontaneous, because it is fully enlightened spontaneously.
The love that is enlightenment, because it is unity of experience.
The love that has no presumption, because it has eliminated attachment and aversion.
The love that is great compassion, because it infuses the Mahayana with radiance.
The love that is never exhausted, because it acknowledges voidness and selflessness.
The love that is giving, because it bestows the gift of Dharma, free of the tight fist of a bad teacher.
The love that is morality, because it improves immoral living beings.
The love that is tolerance, because it protects both self and others.
The love that is effort, because it takes responsibility for all living beings.
The love that is contemplation, because it refrains from indulgence in tastes.
The love that is wisdom, because it causes attainment at the proper time.
The love that is liberative technique, because it shows the way everywhere.
The love that is without formality, because it is pure in motivation.
The love that is without deviation, because it acts from decisive motivation.
The love that is high resolve, because it is without passions.
The love that is without deceit, because it is not artificial.
The love that is happiness, because it introduces living beings to the happiness of the Buddha.
Such is the great love of a Bodhisattva.
Thank you. Okay, so from that I really get a strong sense, I hope you do, of the Bodhisattva has a strong sense of love, of compassion, based in wisdom, based in understanding of how the world works. So I think, yes, so love and compassion have always been a vital part of enlightenment. You can see wisdom, knowledge of how things are, and compassion as two wings of enlightenment. You can't have enlightenment without both of them. But it seems that several hundred years after the Buddha died, there seemed to be a need for this love, this metta, this compassion aspect of enlightenment to be emphasised again. So I think what happens is Buddhism, like everything, goes in phases. So when the Buddha taught, he most definitely taught from a sense of love and compassion for others, as well as wisdom. Well, it was part of the same thing. But it seems that about 500 years after he died, things had got very formal, very literalistic. So it's a bit like people started to look at the letter of things, not the spirit, and get really caught up in all those lists that we talk a lot about. You know, there's 5 of these and 8 of those. And the whole sense of compassion and love in Buddhism had started to be lost, or so it seems. It seems like that. So, So what happened was that the Buddha taught a goal of enlightenment, which you're not going to be able to see at the back, but it says Arahant, A-R-A-H-A-N-T, Arahant. And an Arahant is a pretty amazing figure. It's a being who is free from greed, hatred, and delusion. So They're not acting anymore through those veils or through those lenses, you might say, of self-interest all the time, of seeing things through the need to grasp for them or push them away. A being who really understands how things are. So this is a pretty amazing being, I think. They've stepped right out of the wheel of life and right out of those ruts that we go right round. You might remember from the introductory course, we had the wheel of life and this idea that you just go round and round again. Well, the Arahant is definitely a figure who stepped right out of that. However, it seems that this could perhaps be a little bit selfish, or seen as being a bit selfish, because the beings that were Arahants, free of greed, hatred and delusion, kind of lived in a world of bliss. So it was a bit like, it seemed like some people started to use it as a way to escape from the world, to escape into bliss. Which perhaps it could become a bit selfish, a bit self-obsessed, and leave everybody else behind. So it's a bit like you'd kind of sort your own mental states out, leave everybody else behind. It's interesting to remember that, it's very important to remember that the Buddha didn't see it like that at all, actually. That the Buddha definitely taught that love for others was very important. The first 50 people who became enlightened, who he taught, who were actually interesting raw playboys, they were like kind of young men who'd all been out dancing the night before, and they were the first 50 people who he taught, well, in the first 50. It's important to remember that what he said to them was, he said he wanted them to practice for the welfare of the world. That's quite a common phrase in Buddhism, to practice for the welfare of the world. And also the Buddha himself was known for his own kindness. So for instance, when he was dying, his companion of 25 years, who's called Ananda, who'd spent all that time with him, was very sad, in tears, really sad that the Buddha was dying. And what he said was, he who was so kind is dying. I'm going to lose he who was so kind. So he didn't say he who was so wise, he who was so amazing at being such a good teacher or anything like that. It was the kindness of the Buddha that he was going to miss, that he brought to mind. So it seems like perhaps this kind of spirit of kindness, of compassion, was lost over 500 years. And a new form of Buddhism arose, which was called the Mahayana. And you're definitely not going to be able to see that because that's right down there. I think that's kind of learning here, that we need to up our flip chart, make it higher. But Mahayana, so Maha means big, and Yana means way. So it's the grand way, the great way, the Mahayana. This was a form of Buddhism that developed in response to the idea of the Arahant, to the idea that things were getting a bit literal, a bit kind of closed down. And so what the Mahayana developed was the idea of the Bodhisattva, the ideal of the Bodhisattva ideal instead of the Arahant. And basically the idea here was that you were practicing not to gain nirvana just for your own sake, but for the sake of others. So what a practitioner might do is become partially enlightened, but postpone full enlightenment until all beings were enlightened. Because it was felt that, that the way that people were practicing had become a bit removed from practicing from other people. So, a story that might illustrate this a little bit is if you can imagine that you're quite a strong, fit person, and you're in the jungle with a whole party of people. Some of them are young children, babies, some are old people, sick people. And this is a really scary jungle. There's poisonous snakes all over the place. There's tigers roaring in the background. There's bears. I don't know if you get bears and tigers in the same jungle, but there is in this jungle. And there's poisonous things that you might, poisonous plants that you might just brush against that might kill you. It's just a really scary place. Big ravines you might fall into. So you really want to get out of this jungle. So if you're with this group of people, maybe your tribe, and you're fit and young, do you just go, I'm off, goodbye, because I can make this out of this jungle on your own? That is kind of how the Arahant had started to see. Or do you go, no, I'm going to use my strength so that all of us can get out of the jungle, which is the idea of the Bodhisattva. Okay. But I think it is really important to remember this is a real simplification. Because actually, the Arahant is really free of greed, hatred and delusion. They're not going to be selfish. They're going to be acting for the benefit of all beings. You couldn't be enlightened in that way and not be acting for the benefit of all beings. I think it must just have been that over time, the way that things were approached had become a bit kind of dry, a bit kind of missing something of the heart. So, Interestingly, actually, the revival of the Mahayana, of Buddhism, of this idea of the Bodhisattva ideal, was really, really popular. It really revived Buddhism, so that maybe at one point half of the world was Buddhist. You know, there was a time when half of the world, like Tibet, China, Japan, India, etc., was Buddhist, and most Buddhists have been Mahayana Buddhists. So most Buddhists who've lived have been Mahayana Buddhists. So that's Buddhists who, among other things, practice the Bodhisattva ideal. But for us, if we look at this with modern eyes, we really can't take it literally. We really can't take it literally. Because the arahant idea of being limited, as I said, it really doesn't work. You just can't be enlightened and have this idea. And also the idea that you'd kind of get partially enlightened and then go, no, that's it, until someone else gets, until everyone else gets enlightened. That's kind of a bit literal as well. Because you can imagine this kind of Buddhist standoff at the gate to nirvana with people kind of going, no, after you, no, after you, and nobody ever getting enlightened. So I think in some ways, it's very much, it's an idea that, what happens with Buddhism, I think what happens with everything, as I said, is things are very inspired. They all get years and years and years go by, they become a bit institutionalised, a bit kind of dry, a bit respectable, and then things need reframing. They need blowing apart again. They need a bit of energy, and that's what the Bodhisattva ideal brought, was this energy. But we should see it definitely as a mythic truth, not as literal. Just because it's mythic doesn't mean it's not true. As we talked about in the intermediate class, often things that are mythic are truer than facts, actually. True at a deeper level than facts. So, I think just because it's mythic doesn't mean that it doesn't have a truth to it. And actually, it can help us practice today as well. Because it's not just an interesting, if maybe a bit kind of weird bit of Buddhist history, but actually I think the Bodhisattva ideal is very relevant to us today. It helps us to avoid two different traps we can fall into. One is we practice just for ourselves, or the second is we try to change the world, but we don't realise where the basic problems that have created all the issues that we're trying to change, all the suffering, where they come from. So let's look at those two aspects. So one is that we need to, the Bodhisattva ideal is saying, we are trying to gain enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. So to gain enlightenment, we need to work on ourselves. So that's spiritual development. So that's the path that we've looked at: ethics, meditation, wisdom. Studying, learning about the teachings of the Buddha, friendship. The kind of things we talked about as the ways that we work on ourselves. And we do those so that we become more aware, we become more open, we become kinder. And this is really vital if we want a better world. Because the more that we're driven by hatred, by craving, by ignorance, by those things that are right in the middle of the wheel of life that keep us going round, the more we're going to be part of the problem, actually. Because we're going to be in the world creating more hatred, trying to push things away, trying to get things for ourselves. I was quite involved in politics when I was a lot younger, in my 20s, and after a while I kind of had enough, because I realised that actually if the people that I'd been with had got into power, we'd have been just as bad as the people we thought we would replace, because basically we were very, very angry, and none of us had worked on that at all. We were driven by a kind of anger, like I suppose, we just hadn't thought about that at all. So, and I think if you look at the history of politics being really kind of broad, you can see how, a revolution happens, people come in with great ideas, but then it falls back into the old ways again, craving, hatred, and delusion. So that's at the heart of things, and we really need to work on that. So that's why we need to work on ourselves to become enlightened. And it's important that we really bear that in mind, because we actually live in a world which doesn't particularly value personal spiritual practice. It can be seen as navel-gazing. It can be seen, someone said to me, going on retreat is really selfish. And which I thought was interesting, that going on holiday is not selfish, but going on retreat is selfish. I don't know. Anyway, it's a bit like people don't quite understand, I think, what Buddhists are trying to do. The Buddhist centres sometimes ask, why don't we do some things like run a soup kitchen? And actually there's nothing wrong with running a soup kitchen at all. But because we've got limited resources, what we concentrate on is what we can do, which is teach the reasons why there's a need for soup kitchens in the first place. Because our problems are spiritual ones. We're actually living in an incredibly wealthy society, an incredibly wealthy world actually, And there's enough for everybody. The problem, the malaise, is the way that we as humans are, the way that we are driven by our greed often, or we're driven by our anger. So without understanding that, without working on that, we're just going to keep making the problem rather be part of the solution. And so I suppose what we need to do is we need to work on becoming as awake as we can and to be as motivated as much as we personally can by kindness, by generosity, by love. But if we just concentrate on ourselves, we might find ourselves becoming very self-obsessed. It might all just become about me, my lovely meditations that I have, my blissful meditations, my very interesting psychological problems that I have, all these different things that I'm working through. We can just get really concentrated on that. And it's important that we understand ourselves, but if we just become concentrated on ourselves, well, we're doing something a bit weird, because here we are as Buddhists, we're trying to practice moving away from an obsession with the self. We're trying to move into going beyond ourselves. But if we think about ourselves all the time, it's going to be very difficult for us to move on. It really is a catch-22. And I think this myth of the Bodhisattva ideal really helps us to get into that. Because if we're practicing for others, we're not just obsessing about ourselves all the time. If we want to become the kind of person who can really help others, I think the more that we can be altruistic, the more that we can become kinder and see the needs of others, the more we're going to be able to do that. And of course, we do live in a culture as well that is all about me. Sometimes the Dharma can be something that we do in private. We don't talk about it with anybody else. It can be very, very much about me. So we do need something that takes us away from ourselves. However, if we individually decide, if I decide I'm going to become a bodhisattva, that's really dangerous as well. Because my ego, I suppose, can take hold of that. And it can become me, the bodhisattva, trying to save all of you lot. And I think in the past, I have definitely felt when people are learning how to do that they're kind of trying to bodhisattva me. It's felt like there's been a difference between me and them. And if I've ever done it to anyone, I apologise, actually. But I think it comes from a misunderstanding of what the bodhisattva is. Because the bodhisattva is not going to be one individual as well. And I think particularly in the West, actually, it's really important that we see the bodhisattva in a different way. We see the bodhisattva as Sangha. So I'm going to just tell a story, which kind of, I hope, explains this a little bit, or illustrates this a little bit. And it's the story of Avalokiteshvara, who is this amazing figure here. So Avalokiteshvara, once upon a time, was a normal kind of being with just one head and 2 arms. So this is a picture of a figure who's got 1,000 arms and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 heads at the moment. But once upon a time, they were just a being with just 2 arms and 1 head. And they lived in Tibet a long time ago. And they saw all the suffering that was going on in Tibet. You know, the suffering that we all see around us, the suffering of humankind and of animals. And this Bodhisattva thought, I'm really going to attain enlightenment, and I'm going to help everyone else get enlightened as well. I'm going to make a really strong vow that is what I'm going to do. And the way that I'm going to make this vow even stronger, even more powerful, so that if at any time during my life I decide I've had enough, I can't do it, I just split into thousands and thousands of pieces. So he set quite a high thing for himself. So he set off, and this is a mythic story, the way that he went about helping other beings to get enlightened, he went into a deep concentration meditation for many, many years, many eons. And during that time, he did manage to help some beings become enlightened. When he came out of his meditation, he looked around, and there were still loads and loads of beings who just were suffering, not enlightened at all. So he thought, okay, I can keep going with this. Went back into his deep meditation for many years and years and eons, hundreds of years. And again, came out of it, looked around, still lots of beings. Went back in. Time passes, he comes out again, and he looked around, and he thought, I can't believe it, that I've been, in this deep meditation, I've been doing my best for hundreds and thousands of years, and there are still so many beings who aren't enlightened, who are suffering. I just can't do this anymore, I'm going to give up. So he did, in fact, crack it as his vow said. He just broke into hundreds and thousands of small little pieces. So it's a bit like he tried to do something, and like happens to all of us, just couldn't do it and just broke into pieces. But luckily he was rescued by the Buddha Amitabha. So the Buddha Amitabha is the Buddha of infinite light. He's the Buddha associated with love and compassion. And Amitabha Buddha, who's actually right at the top of him, that little head right at the top is Amitabha Buddha, put him back together again. But he put him back together with the right equipment in order to reach out to all beings. So he's got 1,000 arms, and he's got all these heads. So he's got all these heads so he can see in all directions. And he's got all these arms so that many of the arms are carrying tools, so they can work in different ways with beings who are suffering in the ways that work for them, that's appropriate for them. And we use this myth, this image of Avalokiteshvara, as a symbol for the Triratna Buddhist community, for this Buddhist community. And like each of us can be one arm of Avalokiteshvara. So each of us can be one arm of the Bodhisattva. On our own, we can't be a Bodhisattva, but together we can be a Bodhisattva in the world. And each of us will bring to it something unique. We'll bring some tool to it. We might bring, we might be artists, we might be gardeners, we might be very kind, very good listeners. There's all sorts of different things that we will be able to bring to this Bodhisattva. And our individuality is not lost. So another way you could see it is it's a bit like if an orchestra is going to play, it has to have lots of different people playing different instruments. But they each need to play them as well as they can. So the violin player needs to play the violin really well. The flautist needs to play the flute really well. That person who just hits the drum a couple of times, they need to hit that drum really well. And without all of them doing their own thing, you wouldn't have the orchestra playing music which is bigger than the whole of them together. So it's a bit like us in the Sangha, in the spiritual community. We all bring our individuality, but together we can create something that is bigger than what we could do individually. So that's the myth of the Bodhisattva. And in fact, it's interesting, the Dalai Lama, who is seen by Tibetans as being Avalokiteshvara, a manifestation of Avalokiteshvara, this figure, the Dalai Lama says, well, if he is Avalokiteshvara, then his cook and his driver are Avalokiteshvara too. So it's a bit like they're all engaged in the same project, I suppose. So the Sangha is the Bodhisattva. This is the Bodhisattva ideal reframed for the modern life. So practically, how do we act as a Bodhisattva together? Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to come together as Sangha, like tonight on Sangha night, by working together in teams, volunteering to help keep the centre beautiful, coming to the potato club before Sangha night, bringing lovely food to the potato club before Sangha night, and just together creating an atmosphere of a spiritual community. And the idea at the centre is not that there are some people, like maybe the order members or maybe the centre team, who provide a service for others, who pay for it. It's that we're all in it together. We're all participating together in creating this community, that we're all participating in the Bodhisattva. And in fact, the most important thing we can give to create that community is ourselves, is to bring ourselves into this, is to bring our friendliness in, and to offer other people the opportunity for them to be at their best. I love the idea of Sangha, of spiritual friendship as it's called. It's that what we're trying to do is help each of us to be our best selves. And I suppose all those things are acts of generosity. So it's a bit like generosity is one of the key ways, well, it's not like it is one of the key ways, generosity is one of the key ways that we create a Sangha. And I think there's not only the people who work at the centre and who teach Buddhism and who kind of clean the centre and stuff. Many, many people in the Sangha are supported by the ideas of Buddhism, and they work in the world. Social workers, teachers, artists, doctors, therapists, nurses, they're parenting, doing all sorts of different jobs or different roles out there in the world. And each of us is making the world a better place. And it's like these arms of Avalokiteshvara are just reaching out into the world. It's a bit like we explicitly teach the Dharma here, but we implicitly live the Dharma as much as we can in our lives. So that even if we're not saying to people, I've learnt about the Dharma and I'm interested in it, or I'm interested in being a Buddhist, we can put those things that we've learnt about acting ethically, about being kind and generous, into the world, and it will gradually change the world. It will be the Bodhisattva in the world. Something to remember is that the Bodhisattva, it can sound a bit earnest, I suppose, and quite hard, maybe the way I've been describing it, but there's a wonderful image of the Bodhisattva. So the Bodhisattva is at play. The Bodhisattva is at ease. The Bodhisattva knows what needs to be done, and they play like an elephant plunging in and out of lotus pools on a hot day. So you can imagine what fun an elephant might have plunging into these pools, kind of spraying all the water around, splashing, plunging into another pool. And we as practitioners, as people who are trying to create a spiritual community, we can try and have fun doing that. I think that's really important. It should be, as much as it can, our play to be together. It should be our pleasure to be together. Okay, so that's a sort of brief introduction to the Bodhisattva ideal. And as I said, we're going to teach you, or we're going to talk about these 10 great ways to become as cool as you possibly can. And next week, Bodhinaga is going to start off with the first of those, which is, I've talked a little bit about now, generosity. And he's going to talk much more about this path, these paramitas as they're called, these different ways that we can be. So, I suppose just to sum up, I really hope that I've given you an idea of how the Bodhisattva ideal is about both working on ourselves so that we can overcome greed, hatred and delusion, so that we can become as aware, as loving, as kind, as generous as we can, but then how we can get together with others to create the idea of a community, to become a Bodhisattva, so that this sublime ideal of humanity can manifest here in our Sangha, in Sheffield and in the world.